Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the latest installment of the Baker Diversity Lecture Series. Today we are so grateful and honored to be joined by Dr. Porchia Moore, who is an assistant professor at the School of Art and Art History in the Museum Studies program at the University of Florida. And one of the parts that I'm most excited about, in addition to Dr. Moore's subject matter, is that she is an alum of the School of Information Science here at the University of South Carolina. So we are very, very grateful and thank you so much for joining us today. And we are just going to get Dr. Moore's slides up and running, and then we will be ready to go.
All right, Dr. Cook, thank you so much. So I wanted to begin by expressing how grateful I am for this moment. As Dr. Cook said, I am an alum of the program. I'm super excited about the vision of the program now and the leadership, all of the wonderful scholarship that is coming out of the program. So it just makes me feel really wonderful to be here as a part of the Augusta Baker Diversity Series. And as such, I wanted to dedicate today's talk to my mother, Marie Durant Moore, who was a fourth grade teacher at Hopkins Elementary for over 30 years. My mother introduced me to Augusta Baker at a very young age. My mother would take me to the Augusta Baker Literary Festival at the Richland County Public Library, and I fell in love with Augusta Baker's legacy. So this feels like a really, not just a full circle moment, but a moment that I can just give so much thanks and grace to the opportunity to be able to basically be in service. So I just want to say thank you again so much for this moment. I wanted to begin by talking about my journey as what I like to call myself as a cross-pollinator. My friend Lourdes Santa Maria Wheeler at the University of Florida, Smathers Library, calls herself a musarian. Sometimes I like to kind of think of myself also as a musarian. But my journey as a cross-pollinator really began over a decade ago when I was employed by the Japanese government in a program called the JET program. And the JET program stands for Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. And I was really drawn to this program after earning my master's degree in English literature, because the core of the program, so the one half of the program was to teach English as a second language. But the second half of the program was really to cultivate a love of culture and of heritage in your particular country of origin. And so you were really asked to be a cultural heritage ambassador. Some of the things that I learned about being in the JET program is it really forced me to think about why I loved culture so much. It really helped me to understand the power of culture to connect. It helped me to unpack my own identity as an American. It helped me to really be able to understand what it meant to be an American and to be an American living abroad, and what that cultural legacy and heritage actually conveyed. It also helped me to hone my research skills, because I really had to get at the heart and the depth and the history of some of our cultural heritage holidays, our practices, things like that. And so I really relied upon the help of librarians, and really relied upon libraries as my first resource, and helped me to find the resources to be able to help educate my students. And then actually, this was one of the first times when I lived abroad in Japan where I really began to think about how I could create a space for myself as a cultural heritage professional. And then above all, that time in Japan really allowed me to spend a lot of glorious time in museums. I spent over 2 years exploring almost every museum that I possibly could. I traveled all across Asia. I spent a lot of time in Singapore, in Korea, in Thailand, in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, it was one of the first times when I visited the Te Papa Museum that I really began to understand how much nation building was important to the notion of culture and identity as a nation. I spent countless hours at the Bunkamura Museum of Art in Shibuya, and as well many, many weekends at the Museum of Photography in Ibisu, Tokyo. And again, I began to really think about and cultivate and understand, have a deeper level and passion for museums, but in addition to really think about what is the role and purpose and function of a museum? What was it that kept me returning to museums over and over and over again? Why did they feel so whimsical? Why did I feel so free and liberated? What was it about the process of learning that I really was excited about? And so I really began to very seriously begin to think about pursuing a career in museums. As I mentioned, I have a master's degree in English literature with a concentration in African American literature, as well as a minor in African American history. And so I really began to think about, do I want another degree? And if so, what would that degree be in? So I started to do some research and found out at that time that there were only about roughly 2 programs offering a master's degree in museum studies. And almost overwhelmingly, when I asked other people and I did additional research, people kept saying to me that the pathway into working in a museum was to get a PhD in art history. And so I knew very early on and very strongly that was something that I did not want to do. I did not want to pursue a degree in art history. And I really felt that was a very limiting way to kind of enter into the field. Then I also had a couple of questions. One of my early questions, I was really contemplating, well, what is a museum professional? And also, I was also thinking about returning to school and earning an MLIS. And I really started to ask the question about, well, who are librarians and what do librarians actually do? And I was really encouraged, though, because right before I moved to Japan, I was working as the graduate assistant to the director, Dr. Karen Chandler, who's absolutely wonderful, at the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. And it was there that I really began to understand that there was actually a pathway and a career opportunity for me to be able to enter into the field of museum studies. There were wonderful possibility models. So people like Mr. Sherman Pyatt, who was one of the first Black archivists that I ever met, people like Miss Deborah Wright, who ultimately went on to, who was a librarian and a cultural heritage museum professional, but who also went on to be the assistant director of the Avery Research Center. People like Mr. Curtis Franks, who was an absolutely brilliant curator. So I had all of these possibility models around me. And what working at the Avery Research Center actually taught me, well, first of all, it showed me again in praxis Black excellence and Black excellence in leadership at a really unique cultural heritage institution. It also taught me the power of place. One of the things that was so interesting to me about working at the Avery Research Center was how the history of that place really drew people and it drew community, helped to create and shape community, not just a community of Gullah Geechee descendants and not even just community based on the surrounding neighborhoods, but just also a sense of community of scholars and researchers from across the globe. People who came to the Avery because they had really wonderful collections and they had excellent cultural heritage professionals. Another thing about the power of community is that it was the first time that I was actually able to see what radical trust looked like. So it would be interesting because I'd be working and elders would come in and they would have boxes of material. They would have church bulletins, journals, they would have photographs, and they would willingly hand over these boxes with all of their memories to the professionals at the Avery Resource Center. And what it made me understand was how much trust that the Avery was cultivating for a community, and that there was no doubt that all of the cultural heritage material that was being shared would be properly preserved, would be added to collections in a way that makes sense, but also would be telling these powerful stories in really unique and nuanced ways. So that was really important for me. Then also just the way in which the Avery Research Center worked. They were asking critical questions in a way that actually helped to shape change. They were telling stories, and they were making sure that they were organizing around this really unique cultural narrative. So it was a preservation and a centering of Gullah Geechee culture, but also African-American culture in general. And so it became really clear to me that the glam sector was really vital in helping to sustain a cultural memory of a people. And so as I prepared to sort of leave Japan and kind of move on to really pursue my career in museums, I returned to South Carolina and really thought about, should I become a librarian or should I go into museum work? And so I found out about the certificate management program through the McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina. And when I went, the person that I was speaking with told me about a brand new fellowship opportunity that would be a sort of blending of museum work and librarianship. And so I applied for that fellowship. I was awarded that fellowship, and that fellowship was called the Cultural Heritage Leadership Librarian Fellowship. And it was awarded through the Laura Bush 21st Century Library Program through IMLS. What I specifically loved about the CHILL program was that it was designed as an opportunity to problem solve, which I thought was really unique. And specifically, what the Cultural Heritage Leadership Librarian Leadership Program was designed to do was to be an interdisciplinary focus. So we knew that we would be taught courses in library and information science, museum studies, archival studies, public history, journalism and mass communications, public admin, business admin, technology, and more. So I really like the fact that we were going to have this, we were transcending this sort of traditional disciplinary boundaries. The next thing is that we were tasked to focus on practical problems facing cultural heritage institutions. That was really a draw for me. The third thing was that the informatics perspective of the program encouraged us to explore the connections between technology, information, and cultural institutions. So early on in my program, I was really interested in social networking theory. I was very interested in the connections between cultural heritage institutions and social media. And in particular, I was even more interested in looking at how we could create new partnerships. So the other thing, though, that was really important for me was that while we were invested in higher learning and higher education, it wasn't necessarily an expectation that we would go on to work in the academy, that we were actually being sort of trained to transcend, again, these different boundaries so we could work in libraries, archives, museums, we could work within academia, we could work outside of academia. And that was something that was really important to me. I can be super transparent and say that even though I currently work in academia and higher education, I'm oftentimes in conflict or in tension with academia because of the ways in which we are so isolated. I really firmly believe that we should be practicing public scholarship and embedded scholarship, that we should really be working on the ways in which all of the things that we're learning in academy should have a comparable and parallel access point and extension within varying communities in order to kind of, again, increase inclusion, but also just make it so that we have no barriers to learning, because learning and new information should be accessible to everyone. And so in particular, the problem that I wanted to solve, I had a couple of pressing questions, but for me, the first pressing question was, you know, when I attended all these museums, whether they were in Asia or other parts of the globe, in particular when I was, you know, attending museums even as early as high school by myself because I couldn't get anyone to go to museums with me, the pressing question that I had was, where are all the Black folks when I visit museums? And in particular, I was really tired of having to try and beg and cajole people to go to museums with me. I wanted people to have that same shared passion about museum going as I had. And so I was really intrigued by the Chill Fellowship because I wanted to quote unquote solve that problem. And so one of the ways that I wanted to solve that problem is I really wanted to interrogate the role and function of race, and also the way to look at and examine the way that race sort of showed up in museums and by extension, the glam sector. So one of the things that really I became invested in very early on is the American Alliance of Museums Center for the Future of Museums Trends Watch published this report. And the report was all about the change, you know, the changing racial demographics in America. And I kept going back and looking at this one particular infographic because essentially what it was saying is that the US Census Bureau was letting us know that there was going to be an essential browning of America. But the thing that caught my eye is this very last bar where it says the core museum audience was 89% white, non-Hispanic. So it was like less than 10% of all museum visitors represented by BIPOC folks. And not only was that not acceptable to me, but it also affirmed for me, or at least confirmed for me, that I wasn't wrong in my thinking, that by and large, when I visited museums, I wasn't seeing other people that looked like me. And I thought that that was not only a problem, but that was a real tragedy, and it had to be a huge flaw. I wanted to understand what the flaws were in trying to understand that disconnect between museum going and these different populations. And so I really did not have the right language. I was looking for language, and I was looking for a framework, and I was looking for tools, and came to discover critical race theory. So I could see very clearly that critical race theory was being used to some degree in librarian studies. I was seeing that CRT was being used in some degree in looking at art and art history, but I could not find anywhere someone who was writing and thinking about museum studies and or museums by using critical race theory. And so that became a way that I could actually try and solve that problem, but then also to interrogate diversity. Because what I was seeing is a lot of language about diversity. And what I came to understand very early on was that diversity was very hegemonic. It was a hegemonic term that essentially meant that it did not allow for there to be action-oriented steps to genuine inclusion. And so I felt that relying upon critical race theory was a really wonderful opportunity to advance our field and to create and innovate new tools for unpacking diversity, for understanding inclusion, but then also being able to use the values and the principles around diversity, equity, access, and inclusion as a means to kind of get us past the talk about decolonization and to help us really understand institutional and systemic racism in museums. And so for me, this was really important because, you know, we've had this shift in museums. We've had this sort of new museology where we have scholars like Falk and Dierking who spent the last 20 plus years looking at the motivations and understanding why people go to museums. And so when I read all of their work, what I did not see though was this deep analysis and understanding of race. It was almost as if, I mean, that race really was not a factor. And even when they kind of went back and said, okay, well, it might be a little bit of a factor, it still wasn't a deep enough exploration of race. And really what a lot of that literature, you know, focused on was the different learner types and the museum going motivations of visitors. But that wasn't enough for me. And so when I think about Stephen Will and his sort of mantra that museums are about people and not objects, that was a good shift, but I wanted us to have more. And so critical race theory allowed me to ask new questions and kind of reframe this diversity talk and this multiculturalism talk in a way that I think could advance us forward. So some of those questions were, whose objects are these and how did they arrive? Whose stories are we telling and why or why not? Where does the power lie in our institutions? Who is telling the stories about these objects and what are they getting wrong? And then also who is being excluded and how can we correct those exclusions? And then quite frankly, critical race theory really allowed me to sort of stop fantasizing about museums. And so when I say that term museums, oftentimes in my head, I am adding and libraries and archives. And I would ask you to also do the same thing. And so it helped me to stop fantasizing in a way that made me understand that I could no longer deny that museums were rooted in colonialism and imperialism. That no matter how many sort of Black History Month programs or how many sort of one-off programs that museums offered, it wasn't enough to sort of restore public trust in our institutions in terms of those legacies of exclusion. But also, I think, you know, in terms of critical race theory, it's really imperative that we call those things out and that we name them. And so critical race theory allowed me to call these things out, to name them, to recognize and center the fact that we have historical legacies of exclusion. It really forced me to think about the deep connections between anti-Blackness and museums and cultural heritage institutions in general. And then it really also helped me to understand how imperative it is to promote leadership in museums as a viable career path for BIPOC professionals. And so early on in my program, while I was really hungry for understanding critical race theory as a tool, I also began to work with my colleagues and to call for curriculum reform in LIS. So we started to do a lot of research and a lot of questioning around this notion of liberatory pedagogy. We wanted to understand, particularly in LIS, in terms of librarianship, what are the liberatory pedagogies and practices that we can actually learn from to help shift our respective fields. We wanted to know what are the ways of knowing that have been excluded from the canon? What are the ways in which we continue to privilege white, cis, heteronormativity, scholarship as standardization, professionalization, and institutional metrics for quote unquote goodness? So I interrogated LIS teaching and curriculum, museum studies teaching and curriculum, and archival studies teaching and curriculum. And then again, my bigger question was, how are all these aspects connected to the question of who is visiting museums, why or why not, and who is working in museums, why or why not? And so I kind of want to shift just a little bit, kind of bring all of these things together. I want to talk about museum activism. So museum activism really came about in my mind from several different connected moments in history. And I like to think of museum activism as a way to think about what it means to be radical, quote unquote, if there is such a thing, and what does it mean to be woke. You know, we have this woke culture now, we have cancel culture, but I wanted to really understand museum activism and looking at the roots of where these things came from. So for me, so first of all, I coined the term the inclusive museum movement around 2016. It was first published in the American Alliance of Museums Museum Magazine, an article I wrote about this movement. For me, it started at the American Alliance of Museums conference in Atlanta, Georgia. And it started for me with all of the work that happened in what is now called Museum Workers Speak. And so Alyssa Greenberg had submitted a proposal to AAM where she wanted to really talk about wage and pay equity in our field. She wanted to understand why it was that we constantly promoted unpaid internships in the field. Well, we had never really talked about and unpacked the ways in which unpaid internships continue to create disparity in terms of who gets to work in the field and who doesn't. And so that proposal actually was rejected. And during that conference, Alyssa started tweeting, and she basically said, I still want to have this really viable conversation. So I'm going to have a rogue session. And so she tweeted about the rogue session and passed out some little information. And, you know, I think she was maybe expecting like a small handful of people. We had well over 100, if not 200 people show up to this gallery space in Atlanta to talk about these issues. And it created so much energy, so much passion, so much organizing around this notion about what it means to have a living wage in this field. What does it mean to be degreed or not degreed? And then from there, things for me just sort of exploded. And so that next day, myself, Rose Paquet-Kinley, Margaret Middleton, we were supposed to give a talk about museums and inclusion. And we sat down in the lobby and we basically rewrote our entire presentation right there in the lobby right beforehand. That triggered an entirely different conversation, an offsite conversation with the museum group, also known as TMG. And TMG wanted to have a specific conversation about race. So I would also say that at that time, while we were literally on another offsite session talking about race and museums, for me, it was a time, again, I'm using CRT to ask these critical questions. And one of the things that was really a bit of a turnoff for me, it was really agitating to constantly hear the conversation about we can invite others to come to the museum. It was all about this notion of invitation. And in my mind, invitation was very othering. Everyone should have access to the museum. Everyone should have access to cultural heritage institutions. And I think that the notion of an invitation still others people. So we talked about that. And so right in the middle of this conversation about museums and race, we got the word about Freddie Gray and what was happening in Maryland. And you could see museum directors getting up from their seats, getting these frantic calls about what to do in the museum. Should we close the museum? How are we going to protect the objects? And I just knew right then and there that there was a disconnect. There was so much talk about how to protect the objects that we weren't actually talking about how to serve people, how to serve communities. And so we really began to think about the amazing power of libraries and how libraries had the opposite response. So libraries actually ended up opening their doors, pulling books about police brutality, facilitating conversations, allowing protesters to use the bathroom and other facilities, to give out water. And that, for me, that cultural responsiveness, that grassroots, willing to have active listening and leaning in, that to me is the role and power and purpose of a 21st century inclusive cultural heritage institution. So I say all that to say that is, for me, the germ of when this inclusive museum movement sort of happened. And then from there, we organized again. We had a convening in Chicago. We kind of regrouped and renamed ourselves Museums and Race, Transformation and Justice. Museum workers, Alyssa's work went on to be mobilized as Museum Workers Speak. Later this past summer, Museum Workers Speak came together and created a mutual aid fund that has now raised over $60,000 to support museum workers. And so there was just a lot of movement and energy. At that particular session that Rose and Margaret and I revamped, we were introduced to the amazing Elizabeth Callahan, who now is one of the amazing leaders at the museum, at MIA, Minneapolis Institute of Art. And Elizabeth helped to spearhead and organize what is now known as Mass Action, which stands for Museum and Site for Social Action. And so we have all of these different collectives that have grown up to respond to all of these questions about equity, access, and inclusion in museums, and really specifically looking at the role and function of race in museums. I'll also say that another part of this movement was the work of Adrian and Aaliyah, who started after there was a bunch of us who had written a sort of collective statement asking how will museums respond to all of these different police murders, state-sanctioned violence, because we saw what librarians were doing in response, and we valued that. We thought it was really wonderful leadership and vision. And so both Aaliyah and Adrian, for well over a year, started to have these amazing Twitter chats where they were asking really candid, pointed questions about race and interrogating race. So it was really wonderful to kind of be a part of that. I also wanted to share that the other group, the Inclusium, that I'm so honored to be a part of, we started writing a series of blog posts and creating resources about how to be an activist in museums, or even interrogating that term and understanding what it meant, because a lot of people started to call us activists. And what we really thought was it wasn't really fair to necessarily call us activists. We were just asking questions and making space for others in a way that created space for belonging. And so with Museums and Race, I was asked to be one of the sort of original architects for that initiative. And one of the things that we did was create a statement of purpose, myself and Gretchen Jennings. And we thought it was important to help the field at large understand that it was past time to listen to experiences of BIPOC museum professionals. So we really encouraged anyone who wanted to work with Museums and Race to listen to the experiences, data, and insights of participants. We wanted to create a new paradigm for how museums address their responsibility for fair and inclusive staffing, collections and interpretation, and equality of access to their resources. And so what we specifically introduced then was, again, this statement of purpose. And we wanted to be clear that we were introducing a new set of vocabulary and terminology to the field of museum studies. So we wanted to talk about and unpack oppression, privilege, particularly white privilege, and intersectionality. I will share with you all that, and in doing so, this was one of the most stressful and complicated professional experiences of my early career. When I introduced these terms, I got a lot of pushback of people saying that they'd never heard of the term intersectionality. They didn't know what it meant. They didn't know what it meant to sort of have intersectional, to operate from a place of intersectional museum work. They thought that terms like oppressions, one person in particular said that terms like oppression sounded too radical and sounded too much like the Black Panthers and Huey P. Newton. And so it was really disturbing to me because I understood and was overwhelmed by the level and amount of work that we had to get done in order to truly make museums inclusive, but also to make them anti-racist. And so what I would argue is that museums, libraries, archives, we really need to function, cultural heritage institutions in general need to function as a kind of counter narrative, a kind of response, if you will, particularly in this moment in time, that we need to, as a collective body of institutions, we need to be teaching to transgress, as Bell Hooks said. And so Bell Hooks said in her work, Teaching to Transgress, that we need a new kind of education, that we need education as the practice of freedom, that we need to teach students to transgress against racial, sexual, and class boundaries in order to achieve the gift of freedom. So I would ask that we replace students with visitors, that we replace students with library patrons, or whatever that term is, that museums, libraries, archives, and galleries, so that whole GLAM sector, that we really and truly need to be teaching to transgress. And that I would argue that the real purpose of GLAM in this information age is to function as sites of consciousness, to function as sites of resistance to white supremacist ideology that permeates our nation, to exist as tools for shaping change and creating new worlds, and to exist as places of creative and intellectual respite and innovation. That, to me, is the goal and role and purpose of cultural heritage institutions in the information age in this 21st century. And so one of the things I'm arguing in the book that I'm currently writing is that we need a new kind of information literacy. And in particular, there's no other entities outside of libraries, archives, and museums that are better poised and better positioned to use that framework of EIAJ, some people call it DEIA, to advance cultural heritage informatics. That in actuality, libraries, archives, and museums can help us to become more racially literate, to help us to become more culturally competent, and specifically in this and misinformation age, to help our citizens, first of all, understand their citizenhood, but also help them to increase their critical thinking as a tool to transgress by centering inquiry as a tool for change. That is something that I deeply believe in. One of the things that I wanted to share, in case folks were not necessarily aware, that one of the benefits, or some of the benefits, of critical race theory is that it has these different themes or tenets that can help us to reimagine or revision the practice and pedagogy of DEIA. So some of the tenets include the centrality of racism, understanding the pervasiveness of white supremacy, understanding what interest convergence is, and then critiquing this notion that, critiquing liberalism. So this notion that we are a colorblind nation, that laws are neutral, and that change can and should always be incremental. I would also argue that libraries, archives, and museums are really poised to look at the tenet of the counter narrative. So using that tenet to explore and explain narratives, the ways in which, as a sort of metric to look at the ways in which we have practice exclusion in our cultural heritage institutions. So sometimes I get so frustrated when I look at these collections that are named after all these folks who are not BIPOC, or looking at collections that interpret BIPOC histories in such, or in narratives in such a way that reek of racism. And so I would argue that critical race theory is a way in which we can grow past DEIA work and use it to help strengthen our institutions. In particular, this is important to me. I was starting to get, I'm trying to think of the right word, but I was really starting to, it wasn't panic, but I was starting to go to a place of, deep concern when we were in this former administration that was really using language and rhetoric that essentially propped up racism as patriotism, and was beginning to use cultural heritage sites as a means to further those narratives. In addition, there is and was, there continues to be, a war on critical race theory, which is, to me, not only nonsensical, but it's used as a, it's being weaponized to maintain white supremacy and cultural power. And so I would encourage everyone to truly and deeply understand what critical race theory is, and to figure out ways in which we can use critical race theory to not prop up this this patriotism. I'm sorry, to prop up racism as a kind of patriotism. And so the final sort of things that I want to leave you with is that I believe that we can lead a kind of resistance using our cultural heritage institutions. The first thing, though, is that we have to get clear. We have to get clear about our role and purposes as a collective. What the GLAM sector, I really believe, needs to come together to communicate and collaborate across the disciplines more. We need to come together to generate a vision for abandoning the fallacy of the single narrative. So again, to me, the American patriotism is all about adhering to this single master narrative, that we really have to abandon that. We also have to embrace that neutrality is a falsehood. I think we can lead a kind of resistance by organizing around several action steps. So one of those action steps, I believe, would be to pledge and commit to increasing BIPOC representation across the disciplines. We need more BIPOC librarians. We need more BIPOC museum professionals. We need more BIPOC archivists. The other thing is, I think that we need to commit to learning more. One of the things I've been noticing in the last even 3 or 4 years, even with all of this quote unquote activism and all of the changes that we're seeing in cultural heritage sectors across the gamut, we still have a lot of learning that needs to take place. There's a lot of us that we're either reading the same exact things or we're not reading enough. I think that there's a lot of learning that needs to take place, and we need to be willing to introduce new types of material to our educational process. I also think that it's important for us to innovate. One of the things that I love about the Incluseum and so many other conversations that I am privileged to be a part of is that we're really thinking about, what does it mean to kind of have a death to museums, if you will. So I want to pay homage to all of my friends from the Death to Museums group, and to really think about, what does it mean if we got rid of the term museum? What would it mean if we got rid of the term library? What would it mean if we got rid of the term archive? And really dismantled and unpacked, again, our role and our purposes, but try to innovate into something new. What would that look like? What would it feel like? What would it sound like? It makes me think about 10 years ago when we were writing and talking and thinking about that third space. I think we're at that third space level, but I also think that we are poised to go to a new place. I'd like to see some more innovation in our respective fields. And then finally, I think that we can kind of lead a resistance by empowering our communities, by providing them with information tools and creative ways for using those tools in order to solve problems in their own communities, even in their own households. I think that is the power and the role and purpose of libraries, archives, museums, and galleries, that we should be providing new types of information. And we should also be providing, along with those information, pieces of information, tools, powerful creative tools for using that information to shape change in their world. And then finally, I want to talk very briefly about the Visitors of Color Project. So the Visitors of Color Project is really also part of that museum activism. The project is a co-created project between myself and Nikhil Trivedi, who's an amazing Muse Tech scholar out of Chicago. And we created this project literally, again, it was one of those very responsive moments in the lobby of a hotel right after a really tense conversation about race in museums at the Museum Computer Network conference. And we started off the project by examining the comments of Michelle Obama at the Whitney Museum sort of reopening, where she talked about the fact that there are still people who in the Whitney, who've never been in the Whitney, who would likely never come to the Whitney because they felt like it was a place that was not for them. And one of the things that we really felt that was important is that as museum professionals, we needed to hear and center the voices of our visitors. We needed to learn from them. We needed to humble ourselves and learn from visitors, particularly visitors of color, the ways in which they loved museums, the barriers to museums, all of these different things. And so that Visitors of Color project was born. And so I share that project, though, specifically because when I think about leading the resistance, or when I think about museums as counter narratives, or museums and libraries and archives and galleries as entities of change, I think about the guide to resistance that Nikhil and I created a couple of summers ago. I was in my room, was watching CNN, and I saw Heather Heyer, I believe was her name, be run over, be gunned down by a car because she was protesting or counter-protesting, in response to what was happening in Charlottesville about the Confederate monument. And she lost her life, basically saying that the monument needed to come down. And so it really helped me, it really forced me to think about what was happening, particularly here in South Carolina, this talk about heritage, not hate, and the talk about historic sites and monuments and collections and all these different things that to me just were not connecting. They were not making sense. And what it drilled down for me is, how could we use museums and historic sites in particular, but also libraries, as places of resistance? How could we use these spaces as spaces of beauty and creativity, but also how could we empower communities to make larger asks of their local libraries and museums? One of the things that we have on the guide, and the guide is free to download on the Visitors of Color Project site, but one of the things that we encourage people to do is to basically go to their museums and ask their museums if they were clear about their legacies of exclusion, if they were clear about their origin stories, and if they went to a museum and didn't see an artist that they felt should be there, or a work that they felt needed to be a part of the collection, to feel empowered to be able to ask that institution that. And so that Visitors of Color Guide to Resistance pretty much went viral. We've had, I can't tell you how many downloads. We know that institutions use it all the time. And again, for me, it just really reiterates the power of cultural heritage institutions in the ways that we can not only empower our communities to be agents of change, but that we ourselves can exist as agents of change. And then the other thing that I wanted to add is that in my role at the University of Florida, directing the Museum Studies program, one of the things that we're currently working on is completely changing the way that we think about museum studies. We're changing the ways in which we think about curriculum, and we are leaning upon anti-racist teaching and pedagogies. We are definitely leaning upon and being influenced by the work of authors and scholars like Bell Hooks to use museum studies as a way to shape change in the field, to resist and transgress. Some of those actions include being an intentionally small program so that we're not flooding the field with emerging museum professionals who are entering the job market that basically is non-existent, but also don't have the language skills and the teaching pedagogy to be able to answer these big questions, to be problem solvers. We're making sure that we have an intentionally small program where most of our students are fully funded. We recently no longer require the GRE to make sure that we have fair and equitable access to our program. And again, we're committed to an anti-racist curriculum and pedagogy. And we are dedicated to shaping emerging museum professionals who are entrenched in and understand how to apply EAIJ frameworks to their career paths. And we're working right now on ways to make sure that our students are healing and trauma informed. And the thing I should also say is like the credo for our program is that we believe museums can change the world. And I will end there, and I will happily take any questions from the audience. Thank you.
All righty, thank you so much. That was amazing. So just to the audience, we still have time for questions, so please feel free to put them in the questions tab. So Dr. Moore, I wanted to follow up on what you were saying about the work that you and the program are doing at the University of Florida, and thinking about the students that you will be putting out into the ethos, right, to do this wonderful anti-racist work. And then, you know, some of the job prospects that they'll have, you know, recently we had, I think it was the the museum in Indiana, that in the ad, until they received pushback, said that they wanted someone who knew how to center their white audiences and collections, right?
Yes.
So how do we get your future students, our future students, to be able to get into these places and make enough change, but also, you know, be able to preserve themselves? Because I know that museum studies has as much of a retention issue as LIS.
Yes, thank you for that. You know, I will also say, I will go ahead, because I believe in being honest and transparent. I will also recognize that there are some tensions even having a museum studies program, right? Because I know that there's a kind of school of thought that says that you don't need this particular degree to enter into the field. I don't think you necessarily need it, but I do think that is extremely viable if you have the right program and the right curriculum, the right training. And so I like your question about retention, because I think that that is a real issue. It's one of the things that I've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. I've seen a tremendous amount of BIPOC museum professionals leaving the field because institutions are so deeply entrenched in white supremacy and anti-racist behavior, particularly anti-racist, anti-Black behavior, that there's no way for them to maintain their health, maintain their sanity, maintain even their dignity. So that's a problem. And so that is why where I am currently is that the thinking that I have is that we have to basically die. I mean, I'm saying that language and I'm being intentionally facetious, but we have to die. Right? If you don't like that term, die. What I'm arguing for then is an innovation. We need an innovation in all of our respective fields. Like I said, we need to come together. We need to create new positions. We need to really, I really and truly think that we need to we need to have the new thing. It's not necessarily called a museum. Maybe it is, I don't know. But what I'm hoping and what I'm attempting to do is to create new curriculum, but also, I don't know what that language is, but basically shaping change and shaping a new world by creating a new type of professional. I just think that that's really imperative. And if we all commit to that in the GLAM sector, we can hopefully flood the fields, if you will, and get rid of these people who have the old think, who are holding on as these horrific gatekeepers. If we commit to flooding the field with BIPOC librarians, BIPOC museum professionals, BIPOC archivists, who are coming in, like I said, healing informed, trauma informed, who are coming in with a lens of CRT and social justice, deep and true inclusion, then we won't have to keep asking these questions. We'll have people who just show up in these institutions ready to do the work, who are already asking the right types of questions. So they're not resistant. They're building, they're entering into the field where they can build these things already. So I'm not sure if that 100% answers your question, but that's where I am.
No, absolutely. Thank you. We have a question from Tawana Hodge, and Tawana would like to know, how do you center Black joy in your life and work?
Hey, Tawana. Well, Tawana's asking you that, but Tawana is one of my factors for having the joy that I have. So Tawana is the new, I'm saying new, but she's been here about a year. So Tawana is the DEIA librarian at UF. But also outside of her title, Tawana is an amazing human being. And so Tawana and I, one of the things I like to tell folks who do this type of work is you have to find not your allies, you have to find your accomplices. You have to find people who are willing to be action-oriented warriors on your behalf, who are willing to shape community with you. And Tawana is that person. So I center some of my joy by being able to be in community with like-minded people like Tawana. Outside of that, I'm an avid hiker and nature lover, so I hike a lot. I'm a new plant mom lady. Like previously, before I moved to UF, I was a chicken lady. I raised chickens and I love that. That's my great joy. I currently live in an apartment. I don't have a way to have chickens, but now I'm a plant mom, so I obsessively buy plants and nurture them, and that's been amazing. I like to do a lot of plant craft. But again, outside of that, I connect with like-minded people, and we really are out here in the world shaping change by, forming collectives, having talks, lifting one another up. So that's how I center my joy. And also, I work towards a vision that I believe in, and I show up in that vision every day to the best of my ability. I don't abandon that vision.
All righty, thank you. So Tawana also asks, what current exclusionary practices would you want to be eradicated?
I think the practice, it boggles my mind. We do this, all of us do this, though, I think, no matter what position you have, no matter if you work in libraries, archives, museums, whatever your job is, the practice of making decisions about other groups or demographics without ever not using co-creation as this viable, successful tool and framework. How are you making decisions about other folks and you're not even including them? Like, I think we have to think about how we're going to share power and authority. And I think the best way that you can do that is believing in and utilizing co-creation.
All right, thank you. So I have a question from Jamila Gabriel. This will be our last question. Jamila says, hi, Dr. Moore. I've been following your work for quite a while, and it's always great to hear you speak. You mentioned briefly bell hooks and critical pedagogy. I wonder what your thoughts are about the virtual absence of critical theory and pedagogy in the curriculum of LIS, museum, and archival graduate programs.
I think it's horrendous. I mean, it's horrendous. And to be in 21, even if we didn't have all the things that we've experienced collectively in the last 2 years, it is horrendous. That's why I'm saying it. We have to interrogate that canon. We have to interrogate those ways of knowing. We have to interrogate what we understand as standardization and professionalization. And it's outrageous that we have LIS programs, that we have museum studies and archival programs that are still relying upon old think, but also the thinking of just one particular dominant group. And I think that students need to demand change. And I think that as a collective, faculty members need to come together and have a reckoning. Stop sort of, some of the things that I see sometimes is people having such a resistance. I know that the work feels overwhelming sometimes when you realize like all the things that you really don't know, but you have to be committed to your students and to your profession, I think, and fill in those gaps and just be willing to move towards making that change. Otherwise, you are extremely complicit, and you are okay with being complicit.
Perfect, thank you. And on that note, I'd like to thank Dr. Porchia Moore so very much for joining us today. This was amazing. We could easily have gone for 2 hours so we can fix all these curriculum problems in GLAM. And just a shout out to Jamila, is a doctoral student, so hopefully we'll be future faculty. I think that's part of that cycle.
Hey, Jamila.
Yes. More, BIPOC faculty. So thanks to everyone for coming out today. So very grateful for your time. This session will be recorded and put up on the lecture home probably in the next week or so. And next week, April 1st, our lecture series continues with Tawana Hodge, who Porchia mentioned earlier. So please join us for that as well. And thank you again so much. Always happy to have you here for this conversation. So everyone, be well.
So much.
Be well and enjoy the rest of your evening.